Right. So before we start, then, hello, Holger.
Okay.
So Alan is speaking English, so by default, the session is already turned into an English session now. Yeah, if you're interested, the first thing that may be helpful is I'm trying to make this as interactive as possible, which means a couple of awesome people who share their video feed with me will be helpful, because what you can do is go to compat.pxi.gmbh to the link provided here. What you will find is a little gizmo that is free forever. It is also very early alpha, but at least it's open source. So we'll get to work on this over time. And what you will find is something like this, where once the white balance peters out, you can actually create little notifications for me. I'll just hold them in the camera. I can do the same for you, or if you go there, you may be able to figure this out over time, how to use this in an advanced mode. I can pull whatever I'm tapping here in the app. I can pull this into the video feed. So if you're interested, there is a little help section there. If you switch to English, that will probably help those of you listening. Awesome. So this was a little taste of, okay, let's try to make this a little more interactive than you may be used to. So I'm not going to share my screen, I'm not going to share my screen. I'm going to use the video feed for all the information today. So now that we have the first part of the interaction taken care of, I'm going to dim the lights and introduce you to my friend. So this is Hans Rossling, and I'm going to start with him because speaking about Wardley Maps, I was actually introduced to mapping as a storytelling tool by watching one of his very famous or viral TED Talks. So he passed away last year, I believe. But what he did do is managed to boil down data and statistics into a very compelling narrative through the magic of visualization. So what we're seeing here is the tool that he created to do that. And what I'm going to do is basically mimic him. And I'm going to run this little gizmo, because what you can do is see over time how on one axis, I prepared this in German, so now I need to retranslate everything. So you have income per capita on the x-axis. Over time, people get richer. Everything distributed by region, and then even by country. Each country is represented by a dot, and the population of the country is represented by the size of the dot that grows or shrinks depending on how many people live there. The position of the dot on the x-axis tells us what the income level is, and then on the y-axis we can learn the average life expectancy. So we can see, like about 100 years ago, life expectancy was pretty much lower than it was today. And then through industrialization, we can, like a horse race, see some countries pulling away, and there's something really interesting about to happen just about now. Doink. So there was another pandemic going on. Turns out that those have bad side effects when it comes to life expectancy, or at least the average life expectancy. We'll hope that we'll make it through this one with a little less harsh penalties. But after that, countries bounce back pretty quickly. What we can see is the Western countries, Europe and North America, the USA, pulling away really harshly. So even after the World War, that briefly created another dip in life expectancy, then the economic boom happened. And what also happened quite clearly is that almost all countries experienced certain elevation of if not quality of life, then at least life expectancy. But it's also quite visible that now there's a pretty large gap starting to develop. And it gets more pronounced over time now. But what we also see is that there are a couple of countries really catching up until now. And you may have guessed the really large ones are China and India. And quite clearly, and sometimes even to people's surprise, just the level of income on average is pretty good. We also have a couple of outliers where even though the average income is pretty high and life expectancy is not as high, well, if you have a couple of people who are very super rich and not a big population, those really skew the data in a certain direction. And if the rest of the population who's not super rich is actually piss poor and close to starvation, that doesn't bode well for average life expectancy. So I'm telling you this because this is also a certain kind of mapping. And it actually reminds me of Wardley mapping insofar as there is an implicit X and Y axes in Wardley mapping as well. And what exactly they are and what we can do with them is for us to find out later. So there are a couple of visitors I can see in this session. And I would really love if all of you would ask to join this, because we're few enough people that this is probably manageable. Anybody stepping up? Well, I guess it's getting late, so people are more willing to consume. Oh, there's somebody. Thanks. Hi there.
Hi.
Nice of you to join us. So, let me move to the next section here. And that is the Wardley mapping. So there's this neat online tool, onlinewardleymaps.com, in case you didn't know this, where if you get acquainted with the learning curve about turning plain text into graphs, that may be quite helpful to really quickly develop these. But there's one thing I already find problematic, just in comparison with the presentation we saw before, or the visualization before. So it's really hard to find context at this scale. And even though I did some little trickery with the labels in the previous graph of Gapminder, the story inherent is, let's say, more intuitively available. You can grasp it quicker by just looking at this. So at least one thing we can try now is move here. So another thing that's only going to start now. Yeah, so another experiment I was trying out is of the automatic captioning I can put into the video feed. Unfortunately, this only works as soon as I run the PowerPoint presentation. So what you're seeing is actually me grabbing the automatic translation from PowerPoint, trying to come to grasp with my German-flavored American accent. Yeah, putting this back into the video feed, and you guys can tell me if you can actually read this. Is this helpful at all? Awesome. So now I've put this in front instead of behind me, so I can start pointing again at things. And so if you maximize my screen in Hop Into, in this web app, you may be able to start to read the labels. So I try to make them as big as possible to start become readable, even though at this point, it doesn't really matter. This is just a demo just about how Wardley Maps have this inherent problem of if you want to present the thing, there's a steep learning curve involved. You actually have to explain a lot of assumptions that this makes. And two, they're not the best visualization to present in terms of just the way of scale of things. So when I created this session, one of the original briefs was, for the whole conference, I believe, is, you want to change people's minds. And to do that, the tools we use must work in the context where we use them in. And in this context, what are ways for us or for me to use the concept of Wardley Maps and make them more presentable? That was one of the ideas I had while developing the visualization further. So there's something about hidden assumptions, namely that this axis clearly makes an assumption about evolution, which I believe doesn't really do the idea of evolution justice. So if in biology 101, we learned evolution isn't directed. And this graph clearly makes an assumption about, you move in one direction. And that is fine if you're telling a story of, directed evolution or of development. What I believe actually is helpful, if you use the term or the metaphor of evolution, is that if you forego the notion of directedness, it actually makes sense that lots of items tend to move in the same direction because they share the same ecosystem. It's all businesses inside, the capitalist system. So the incentives are the same, that the ecosystem is the same, which makes it plausible that there are certain pressures, like evolutionary pressures in this metaphor, that make companies behave the same way, and that make the directedness appear, even though it is not actually directed. So if you want to have a really fancy term for this, it's teleological. So driven by its outcome or goal, which this is probably not, neither the development of business nor evolution. So I talked about these ecosystems and how I believe that they still help us, especially if we categorize things now, to understand the pressures. And what I believe is always present if humans are creating and designing things as a driving factor is intent. So intent doesn't always result in a foreseeable outcome, because that's the nature of complexity. You have emergent behavior. You cannot really determine the outcome by the input state. But because of a shared ecosystem, a shared environment, and incentives and pressures, there tend to be aligned behaviors. And also people are quite good as a communication game of finding common understanding over time. As long as everybody is a willing participant in the game, it turns out that, what at first is super fuzzy, at least if you put enough effort in, and if everybody collaborates and trying to understand each other, you arrive at a more clear understanding of what you're discussing, which is the point of creating maps as well. You want to help facilitate this very process. So this was really fuzzy. And by the way, did any one of you know this graph, the scribble? Did you see this before?
What scribble do you mean?
So this is actually called the scribble. It's from a certain design school. Tells you that even design over time, if you create a product or a service, you arrive through thinking the idea through, you arrive at a point of clarity, and that's where the product becomes to emerge and become usable and useful. So we still only have this one axis. I'm going to show you a graph that's a little more structured, and I wonder if either of you, just by telling at the shape of the graph, can tell what story it tells us. If we do now actually have to have the second axis of happiness and unhappiness. So this is the graph of a story. Somebody starts out at a really low point and gets gifts, makes them slightly more happy, gets another gift, makes them even more happy, gets another gift, makes them slightly more happy. And then there's this huge event, and she moves to a place where she meets the most amazing person. Unfortunately, it only takes 12 strikes of the grandfather clock for that happiness to dissipate, but she never arrives at the low point she was before. She carries the memories of that one moment. She never will forget this. Anybody know what the story this is?
So Cinderella.
Exactly. So yeah, this is a Kurt Vonnegut graph about one of the prototypical stories as mapped onto an axis of happiness. Which goes to show that stories themselves are really good, mappable. And it brings me back to what drives the storytelling usually, is making intent visible or comprehensible. What I would like to try is come to a definition of progress that's actually useful, especially in the context of, again, for this session, the word was sustainability, I believe. And that's something that's not very well represented if you are, let's stick with this for a second. If you're basically describing human progress also as, you can take the happiness and then the unhappiness as a scale of life expectancy, and progress as economic progress. This tells us nothing about the resources you consume for the Western countries to really move ahead in this rat race and arrive at the top right. It's really compelling. You see this graph going from the bottom left to the top right. It really looks like an amazing progress story, but it leaves out the detail. What are the costs involved in reaching that point? And will everybody else be able to follow the same journey? And a couple of other frameworks tell us probably not. Common sense probably tells us that too, because we know that we've already arrived at a point in time where we have a carbon deficit. We cannot consume carbon dioxide or cannot burn at the rate we have been burning it, and that means that progress must be achieved in another way, and perhaps it needs to be defined in another way. So the model that really helped me grasp this is Kate Raworth. I know this graphic is in German, but I prepared, before starting this really quickly, the interactive version on our website. So now the multitasking is getting really challenging. So and which one do I have now? This goes away and this goes on. Okay, so if you haven't seen this before, you can just go to this website and you'll find the same interactive gizmo. But the principle is interesting anyway. I can illustrate even if again, the text is unreadable at this resolution. So let me interact with this. This is the default state, the current state of the world. And the green circle gives name to the donut. Whatever is outside of the circle, you have this arrow pointing outwards. Whatever is outside of the circle tells us there are upper boundaries of resource consumption that the planet can sustain. However, if we want to achieve progress in terms of giving equal opportunity and quality of life to everybody living in this ecosystem, and this is the inner circle, and this should be full in a perfect world. Everybody has full opportunity. Everybody has access to all the facilities that they need. All needs are met, and they're met equally. So I actually need to resize this on my screen so I have a chance of reading this myself. So we have some of them are double concepts. So here we have peace and justice in one graph. And the one side of it is the population in countries with corruption, perceptions index X, and the other is population in countries with a homicide rate of 10 or more for 10,000. So peace and justice, two sides of those coin of this coin. That's a apt metaphor, probably not. The two parts of the concept are not equally met. Oh, so we got Ralf Kruse wanting to join. Probably takes a second, or he left again. Now, what's also interesting about this, and also maybe inspiring for Wardley Maps, is again the concept of things are quantifiable, and the quantity then can be matched or mapped against thresholds, and you can make a value judgment about this. Okay, this is too much. This is too little. However, I also find this a bit hard to read or at least I find it very hard to map a story of progress against this, because now you're missing this really compelling, if perhaps a little bit devious almost visualization of two graphs and from the bottom left to the top right kind of idea. It's just it draws you in. It's progress, and here it's really hard. Okay, we know the inner circle must be filled, and the outer circle should be empty, so you haven't exceeded the boundary. Hi, so is online. Which brings me to potential way to merge those ideas. And again, the multitasking is challenging. We are back here and just run the presentation. And this is where I haven't gotten to the translating everything in time. So what you have is, if I want to incentivize, because that's actually part of my job as a designer, also working in strategy consulting, I want to change minds, but not because I want to convince people of something that isn't in their best interest, but instead of providing them the concepts in which they can grasp, okay, this actually is helpful. Much like the Wardley maps, you help them understand the landscape and help them understand what kind of plays they have available in this landscape, and how they can then shape their environment. So what we have is 3 concepts for companies that map really well to things Kate Raworth put into writing. If I boil this down to 3 things that are really important to companies, it's resilience. And if your ecosystem is being corrupted by your actions, even if it's kind of a tragedy of the commons phenomenon, I'm just burning the coal because I need the energy, but everybody's doing it. If it were only me, it would be fine. But because it's everybody, it's bad for everyone. Still, I know for one, the play is bad, even if it's one that is only bad at scale. But still, if I'm contributing, I'm actually hurting my resilience as a company, and this is measurable. So again, we don't have to invent the numbers. There are studies available with which we can then develop thresholds. Like obviously, if you're an insurer, your premiums have to go up over time for places built next to coastlines, and you have a 50-year horizon thinking about, okay, how can I insure against weather or disasters? Clearly, you must change your portfolio in some way to become more resilient against those challenges. So another part then is innovativeness, or would you say innovativeness? So your propensity and ability to innovate as a company. And this maps really well to societal progress and equality. So we find lots of studies. I read one recently. Was it Bain? I'm going to look this up if you need me to. Which says that there is about a 20% improvement for companies who have a diverse workforce in terms of the innovations they're able to produce. So you are more innovative, the more diverse your workforce is, the more perspectives you have inside your company, and you're also paying into equality. If you are paying Black people, you are paying into equality. If you're paying people of color, you are paying into equality. Well, now confined to your little ecosystem. But this is where it gets interesting. If we now accumulate this over time and we turn this into a play on a map, we can say, hey, this is you also changing the ecosystem. And finally, the last bit where I haven't found great examples to model this after, but I think this is the one that ties the other things together for companies. And now I'm at a loss for an English word because I haven't developed this in English. It's like the responsibility index. There's something about the incentives of capitalism that drives everybody to externalize costs. You externalize the cost of somebody having to clean up the pollution you produce. Lots of companies don't really pay for the damage they cause. They are using water to cool down their plants, and thus changing the ecosystem of the river downstream. And I come from a region in Germany where we have something called Ewigkeitsschulden. So in the coal mines in the western part of Germany, there's whole villages that we know need pumps running for eternity because there's quicksilver and other heavy metal polluted water from tunneling under the whole region. It's really a network of tunnels under all the villages and cities in the Rhine-Ruhr region. So forever and all eternity, pumps must be running to keep this polluted water away from the groundwater, which is the drinking water. And there was a one-time payment, and there are contracts in place about the companies who benefited from extracting the coal. But they aren't obligated to keep paying this forever and ever. At some point, the government steps in, which is, again, outsourcing of the costs you had to actually be able to produce the value at the time. And this is just the most egregious example of this in Germany. And I believe through measuring this, how much do you actually willingly outsource your responsibility of public costs? How much are you willing to actually take on as your responsibility to solve? That is something I'm quite sure is measurable because when I was studying in Japan, we had studies. Okay, the echo is actually bothering me. Is it Charlotte? Is this okay? I can mute other people. That's probably helpful. Thanks. So we know that if political pressure is high enough, then all of a sudden certain outsourced, so this is Ralf, the externalized costs can actually, through political pressure, be put back onto the companies, which incidentally turns into an innovation boost. So the whole auto industry in Japan is super efficient because was it in the 60s, 50s even? The pollution became basically unbearable, and now they had to find a way of turning whatever they produce as waste into more useful means. And even if it was just a change in mindset, or if it actually was the technology they invented to be able to meet those the political demands, turned the Japanese auto industry or heavy industry into the most efficient model of planning for a long time, I believe. So now that we, these are the three elements I believe are necessary to turn into useful action, perhaps plays on a map, the concepts that a company needs to orient itself. And what's nice is that progress can still, whoa. So it looks like my presentation didn't update in the cloud. So I'm wondering, yeah, no. Let me double check if I can push this again. And so just today I told people that actually the syncing works pretty well in PowerPoint, and now it's letting me down because it works on one computer. And it's been about half an hour since I copied the slides into this presentation, so it probably won't update in the next half a minute. So what I'm going to do is find a way of showing you the final two slides. And I'm going to export them as PDF and put them on the other machine, which has my camera on it. Export 1415. Okay, just about 1 minute. So in the meantime, is there anything so far that caught your attention?
When you were talking about sustainability, that prompted a couple of things to mind. The UN sustainability indices,
yeah,
and the ethical OS toolkit. So I think they have maybe some form of measurements built into those things, but I don't know where you were going with that thought.
So yeah, there is also, especially when it comes to CO2, what you have are defined thresholds about the at least for every country. I know those are like officially determined. You have a budget, and how much budget do you have until 2025 if you want to meet the agreed goals? That basically is quite simple math. You know, just distribute it over the whole world, the available CO2 budget against the predicted 1.5 degrees warming.
But that one was
so
easy though, because they wanted to create a market. So they needed to measure it.
Yeah. So I'm going to, where am I here? And this, and put an image inside. And that is, and now I need to add a green screen filter. Okay. So there it is, just reposition this. So what I did is, perhaps if I enlarge this, it may help. So not all the colors translated properly right now, unfortunately. Anyway, so you may recall the three concepts. What we have is, if you take something like a Wardley map and flip it on the side, now you do have a goal. And that goal is, what is your impact on your environment? And environment now meaning both the actual ecosphere and society. The thing I didn't mention is the original two axes we had for progress can now be depicted as two bar graphs inside a pseudo or derivative Wardley map that's flipped on the side. Same goes, I could even map impact through the size of each thing. What I can do is now with a company who I'm visiting is at some point in their strategy cycle, say, okay, let's talk in your value chain about this middle section. And I also introduced different sections than are available in the original Wardley map. So I start with, here is everything that is produced outside of the company, basically, and I need to run through this middle section where all my processes turn this into new sort of value, add value, or transform whatever input comes from here. And then there's the delivery side, also marketing channels, whatever. And we have our little avatar lady here. Only this is where things become really visible. So this is client facing. The client may know what we're doing because we're telling about what we are doing, but the client probably, so the end customer, probably doesn't know, what's going on here. Just like with Wardley Maps, the invisible parts of your value chain. And I changed the original categories of evolution slightly because I believe they can change over time. If the ecosystem changes, all of a sudden something that was experimental over time becomes more trivial. But something that once was trivial, given the right circumstances, can very well turn into something that is handcrafted, available only. So try to buy vinyl music now. It still exists, but it turns into a more expensive item. And it actually, for a niche audience, it's not just about a sentimental value, but there are places where you can have records pressed that are used in specialized remix battles and that sort of thing, where vinyl has more than sentimental value, but is actually useful and also has the little side effect that it deteriorates over time, and that's actually something that is useful for some people, or at least something they want out of the thing, so that it has kind of a lifespan, and that can also make it more valuable. So those things are example of where I feel it may be more helpful even for regular value Wardley maps to think of an ecosystem as something that isn't teleological, that isn't outcome driven, but that is environmentally driven. Again, if we frame environment as both the ecosphere and the society in which a company operates. So what I can do now is turn the three categories again in three thresholds, just super simplified. Okay, you're either adding value, you're being neutral, or you're being detrimental to human progress at a certain point in your value chain. Because obviously not all parts of the value chain are created equal. Interestingly, I learned this in another talk about Wardley maps. Commoditization itself can already be a very broad indicator of sustainability, because things that are things that scale usually don't, at scale produce as much waste as having each thing, handcrafted more or less, if it involves industrialized processes at least. I don't know, Alan, what's your take on it?
Cars are highly commoditized, but they're in no way sustainable. Oil production, highly commoditized, in no way sustainable.
The thing is, from that talk only, if you have the same thing and it is not commoditized, so oil production is not sustainable because the business itself or the part of the value chain itself is problematic. It isn't that the thing produced at scale makes it problematic. Actually, that's the phrase that way. Yeah, it is.
It is.
But
I understand what you mean. I'm not sure there's
even things that burn energy. So huge data centers are still more economical at scale than having all those data centers compartmentalized, and now they're not just running servers, but everybody also has to fuel the whole infrastructure that surrounds the thing. Okay, that was a tangent and probably not super helpful. At least you're not following the argument. I found it interesting. It was again, I can look it up if you want to follow the talk from the guy who introduced the idea. Anyway, I find more interesting. Anyway, I can now point to parts of the value chain and say, okay, here we're in the this is what we do internally. And let's talk about our wage structure. And clearly, some parts of the value chain have less of an impact on some parts of the ecosystem. So my wage structure probably is pretty much neutral when it comes to ecological impact, right? It doesn't really... I can't really find a correlation between wage structure, easily at least, wage structure and the ecological footprint. But I can find, okay, this is a beneficial thing for equality, for societal progress. If I find ways to pay fair wages, to begin with, and then again, if I pay fair wages to a more diverse workforce. And like we said, that actually now has, slightly or tiny beneficial effects on my environment. So I'm shaping the environment as I, put this into the world. Now I'm making my country, perhaps as a whole, a little bit more equal. If I the more so if I do this openly and now turn into a change agent as a company and say, hey, we can also use this for marketing. We really believe in equality, and which means our CEO has the same salary as everybody else. Whatever you come up with as an innovative wage structure that really does meet, equality standards and provides beneficial. And you'll probably find all sorts of other examples. And what I'm grappling with right now is trying to also turn this into categories, meaningful categories, because that's actually, I think, some of the best parts about the whole Wardley mapping universe is the sociological eye for detail in finding meaningful concepts that are helpful to address. And finding those kinds of concepts now for, okay, what part of the company can I systematize how I describe value chains even more in terms of this of their impact on the environment. That's the step I'm at right now, and perhaps you even have some insight from the practice or just first impressions now that you've seen something quite new introduced in such a short amount of time. Thanks so far, and looking for your input.
I think I need to absorb that.
Yeah, I really like the idea to put these thoughts into, Wardley Maps are a tool to make strategic decisions, but there's, in the Wardley Map at itself, there's nothing about responsibility, sustainability, and I think that's really great, because it should be part of making strategic decisions for companies.
I think your assessment of things like vinyl, for example, as being something that moves back and forth is quite accurate, quite correct. And Wardley's version of evolution is definitely very linear and very mechanical. Right? It's just an inevitability of progress that is expected, almost demanded. And I don't really account for the human factor. It's just this thing is going to move there. Of course it is, but that doesn't explain things like Betamax versus VHS, right? The human factor of just it didn't do that, and that kind of chaos isn't embedded in there. And I think you're stepping towards a sort of at least back and forth is a step towards that, which I like, and I quite like your pivot. I think that orientates that expresses it better to flip it.
You can also, if you have like some other things you want to bring into the map, to use just colors in the dots like you did, it's a good idea for other axes or sides of the thing you want to map.
Yeah, that's actually one of the original challenges I tried to address, was introduce more dimensions. Like from a statistical point of view, map more information on a two-dimensional plane. So what can you do? And again, learning from the original master, Hans Rossling, with just the size of dots, it's really helpful to use size. If you dive into data visualization, obviously there's lots of best practices and things you can learn if color is useful, or some may actually warn you against using color as a way to transcribe meaning. If you have a very strict color policy that and use luminance so that it becomes or stays accessible, for disabled people, visually challenged people, that they can still make out the data, then it's probably robust enough to work in every context. But yeah, so that's not easy to use. Color size obviously is the one that does work, even though circles are also problematic. But that, design is always this weighing of pros and cons and mitigating conflicting constraints. The circle is almost necessary if I want to have data turn into size by using petals. There's almost like a rose petal diagram. For that to work, I need the circle as the basic shape. And I decided to use thresholds only, so that it becomes more readable. You don't have to try to think, okay, is this a pixel more or less? It doesn't matter. You have hard thresholds, and only if they're met is the next petal going to be filled. So that's probably a safe decision to use a petal illustration at that point.
How consumable?
Pardon?
How I think one of the beauty of Wardley Maps is the simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
How much do you see the fear that by extending it with further information actually makes more people lost? Or how do you prevent that?
So I think it's not an issue insofar as the original Wardley map already requires a workshop to get people on board. So there really is an onboarding process involved in getting people to work productively with a Wardley map anyway. So if you have that sort of barrier to entry already, trying to introduce a sensible learning curve probably makes sense. So if you're extending it, and not by introducing complexity, even more willy-nilly, but making even more pronounced decisions then about, okay, what parts of the environment are we now going to talk about, and what are we going to highlight, and what are we going to filter out. So that's then a facilitator's challenge, I believe, more so than the challenge of the visualization itself. Much like in Wardley Maps also, I think, at least that's my experience. I really only ever started with the basic idea, first introducing people to a value chain who aren't used to thinking along those lines, is already a new concept for many, and new concepts are always difficult to grasp and need time to immerse yourself in it. So the more advanced things like running plays in a map and then showing barriers and all that sort of stuff is not something that I think I can do on a first day of a workshop usually. But I'm not the greatest practitioner of Wardley Maps, so perhaps again, if a facilitator is strong enough, you are able to run it like that. I don't know what's your experience.
So mine is low. I just thought about exactly based on that to grasp this new concept, to really have a first focus and maybe later extend it. I'm not sure if we help us too much to extend it too early.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a feeling. But if you have that in there and have the sense that you get fluent in there, it must be easy to have colors, shapes, sizes in there to add further dimensions.
Yeah, exactly.
A real difference in how you build it and what the intent is behind it. So you're showing this fully formed thing, demo, but fully formed thing. So you've got a certain need for doing this live in that kind of workshop, and it grew organically. You wouldn't need all of the elements necessarily. It would depend where the conversation went. And some of those, I look at those bar charts and I think that's kind of a noisy element on the graph. But you might not need that if the conversation doesn't go there. And then the flip side is if the result, the output of that conversation is something you want to take to another group, they haven't got that context. and I think it's going to be hard for them to extract too much content. So going back to a simpler form, but then a different group would produce a different map. So how useful is it to transport it anyway?
Fair enough. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
How did you do the overlay? Is it multicam, or what did you do? When you
So I'm running everything through OBS as an open source software. So that's cheap. The problem is running several video streams basically through the same processor is really challenging, more so than you may suspect, unless you are into technology. So I was a bit naive at first as well, and I actually had to buy a proper workstation to make sure that the processing power at least isn't the bottleneck. Because as soon as you start, those are like 5 sources simultaneously. You saw all the overlays, especially if I want to do this even more interactive and have things moving around and actually click on things in a browser that then also runs on screen and consumes memory as well. You probably need to invest in a bit of a higher end machine. Well, at least not the entry laptop won't cut it any longer.
It's very effective. Yeah, it's very engaging way of putting content across. I did appreciate that.
Thanks. Yeah, that was one of the experiments today. There is a last one in terms of you could annotate this. That was the hope if the group was large enough. What you can do is if we go to this again, damn it. This and this we won't need. This we need. So you can open this address in your browser. And I could, again, now need to input the image. And if you're feeling cheeky, you can even draw circles around me. So yeah, that was my attempt, if we had gotten that far, at introducing really low barrier interactivity where everybody can interact with the screen. Let me actually... So what I can do is clear this. And what I'm doing here is I'm pulling browser data, and I'm using lots of web apps actually, and do a little bit of media hacking. So if you know your way around HTML and CSS, what you can do is overwrite certain parts of the web page you're using, which is why we're only seeing what's being drawn and nothing about the user interface on the video camera, because I delete everything from the browser source that I'm pulling into my video feed.
Impressive.
Yeah, so this is something we've been working on for the last couple of weeks or months, actually, because everything takes forever right now. Lots of us in my little design consultancy, we have small children. And in Germany, there was a bit of a problem with child care situation. So usually you bring them to the kindergarten. And until a couple of weeks ago, there was no kindergarten anymore. So my wife and I decided, okay, we each have a 3-day work week now, and the same applied to everybody in the company basically. So our productivity was more or less halved. Yeah, so that was challenging. But what we try to do is make what we actually sell is usually workshops, and really intricately produce workshops to create meaning. Strategy consultancy with companies. Turn them into virtual events, and using our experience in technology and media to, as best as we can, provide an experience that comes close in a virtual environment of making it more engaging. And now we're gonna turn this into a service we sell, helping other people create the same. So if you know anybody who may be interested in that kind of service, I'm always willing to entertain offers. Okay.
Thank you very much once again for your talk.
Thank you for being here and being active participants. That was more than useful. It was borderline necessary, and I'm glad that even though the title was in German, some people did find their way here.